Illinois's Cahokia Giants. The 1879 plow crew that tore open a 1,500 grave bed. In the spring of 1879, a farm crew was breaking new ground in a field outside East St. Louis. 3 feet down, the plow hit something hard. They thought it was a root or a buried stone. It was a femur, 34 inches long. By the end of that week, those farmers had uncovered the edge of a burial bed that newspapers would claim held 1,500 bodies, and many of them, the report said, were not the size of any human walking the earth today. But the strangest part of this story isn't what they found, it's what happened to all of it. Before we get any deeper, if you want more lost history like this, hit subscribe. We dig into a buried story every week. Now let's talk about what those farmers actually pulled out of the ground. To understand what happened in 1879, you have to understand where it happened. The land east of St. Louis sits in what geologists call the American Bottom. It is flat, alluvial, fed by the Mississippi, and for thousands of years it was one of the most densely populated places in North America. Long before the United States existed, before any European had ever crossed the Atlantic, this stretch of Illinois floodplain was home to a city. A real one, with streets, plazas, neighborhoods, and a population that some estimates put higher than London at the same time. We call it Cahokia today, but the people who built it left no written name for the place. They left mounds, hundreds of them, earthen pyramids rising out of the prairie like the work of a civilization the textbooks could not quite explain. The largest one, Monk's Mound, is bigger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Stop and think about that for a second. The biggest pre-Columbian structure in North America is sitting in a soybean field outside St. Louis, and most Americans have never heard its name. The city was not small. At its peak, somewhere around the year 1100, now Cahokia covered nearly 6 square miles. There was a grand plaza at the center, larger than 35 football fields, ringed by smaller plazas, residential districts, and what archaeologists today call elite compounds. There was a wooden palisade 2 miles long with watchtowers at regular intervals. There was a circular timber observatory, often called Woodhenge, a line to mark the solstices and equinoxes. There were causeways, there were canals. There was a level of urban planning that the official history struggles to attribute to the people credited with building it. By 1879, the official story was already locked in. According to the Bureau of Ethnology, these mounds were built by the ancestors of local tribes, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years ago. Case closed. The mound builders were Indians. There was nothing mysterious here, nothing that required further explanation. The farmers working the land, however, kept finding things that did not fit. The crew that broke ground that April was led by a man local records refer to only as Thomas H. They were laying out a new section of farmland on the edge of the old mound complex. The field had been worked before, but only the topsoil. Nobody had ever cut down deep into the earth because there had never been a reason to. That spring they decided to level a slight rise in the field for irrigation. The plow team started in the morning. By noon, they were pulling out bones. The first one was the femur, 34 inches long, according to the account printed in the Madison County Press the following week. For comparison, the average human femur is about 18 inches. Some of the men assumed it was an animal, a horse maybe. But the second bone came up an hour later, and it was unmistakable. It was a human pelvis, and it was the size of a bushel basket. They stopped the plow. They dug by hand. By sundown, they had uncovered 4 full skeletons laid out side by side, oriented east to west. The skulls were intact. The jawbones were larger than the palm of a man's hand, and in the upper jaw of one of them the men counted a double row of teeth. That is the first thing that should make you stop and think, because double rows of teeth, sometimes called duplicate dentition, appear in newspaper accounts of mound openings across the entire Mississippi and Ohio river valleys throughout the late 1800s, Wisconsin, Indiana, Tennessee, West Virginia. The same anomaly, in the same kinds of graves, decade after decade. Either every small-town newspaper editor was lying about the same specific detail for 40 years, or something was actually being pulled out of the ground that did not match any known human population. Word spread fast. By the third day, neighbors from the surrounding farms had come to look. By the fifth day, a stringer from the St. Louis Globe-Democrat was on site. By the end of the week, the farmers had stopped trying to count the bodies. They had cut a trench roughly 40 feet long across the rise. In that trench, they found bones in 3 distinct layers. The top layer held smaller skeletons, what the newspaper called regular size. The middle layer held the giants, and the bottom layer, which they barely touched before stopping, held more bones than they could process. Skulls stacked against skulls, femurs laid in parallel rows. The reporter who arrived from St. Louis described it as a bed of bones, and that phrase stuck. By the time the local sheriff arrived to assess what was happening, the estimate had climbed to several hundred bodies. By the time someone from the State Geological Survey showed up the following week, the working estimate was 1,500. 1,500 bodies in a single burial. Try to picture that. Not a graveyard with scattered plots. A single excavated bed, laid out with intention, holding the remains of a population larger than most small towns of the period. The geometry of the burial was not random. The skeletons were oriented. The layers were separated by what looked like a deliberate covering of clay and ash. Whoever buried these people knew what they were doing. They were not victims of a battle dumped in a pit. They were placed. Each one was set down by hand, by other hands, in a sequence that suggests ritual. There were also signs of ceremony. The reporter who returned for a second visit described what he called a hearth area at one end of the trench, a flat slab of fire-cracked stone surrounded by a ring of darker earth. Around the slab, the smaller skeletons had been arranged in a half-circle, almost as if observing something. He noted that none of the larger skeletons were placed near the hearth. They were laid further out, in their own deeper layer, with what looked like a separation between them and the rest, as if the people who buried them did not consider them part of the same group. And then there were the giants. The first detailed description of the larger skeletons appeared in a follow-up article in the Belleville Democrat about 3 weeks after the discovery. According to the article, 12 of the skeletons in the middle layer measured between 7 and 9 feet long. The longest one, recorded by 2 separate witnesses and a county surveyor, was 9 feet 4 inches from skull to heel. The skull on this one was described as elongated at the rear, with a heavy brow ridge and that same anomaly. A double row of teeth in both the upper and lower jaw. The Globe Democrat reporter, who returned for a second piece, wrote that he held one of the femurs in his hand. He estimated its weight at 11 pounds. He noted the density of the bone. He wrote that the marrow channel was unusually narrow, suggesting that whatever creature this had been, it was not just tall, it was heavy, built dense, built for force. That detail rarely gets discussed in modern conversations about the mound builder mystery. The skeletons were not just large, they were structurally different. Heavier bones, tighter joints, skull shapes that did not match modern human variation. If you read the original accounts from these excavations carefully, what comes through is not a population of unusually tall humans. It is something else, something the people writing about it had no scientific category for. The county surveyor, a man named Hollis, made a sketch of one of the skulls before it was removed. That sketch was later reproduced in a small circulation historical pamphlet around 1894. It shows a cranium that is roughly 30% larger than a normal human skull, with an occipital bun, a sloped forehead, and a prognathic jaw. The orbital ridges are pronounced. The cheekbones flare wider than modern anatomy. Whatever this thing had been, it was not simply a tall man. It was, in proportion as much as in scale, something else. And then there were the objects. Mixed in with the bones, the farmers and the visiting officials found things. A copper breastplate, hammered thin, almost 3 feet across, marked with symbols that none of them could read. Several smaller copper pieces shaped like crescents. a black stone disc about the size of a dinner plate, polished smooth, with what one report described as concentric grooves of unknown purpose. Beads carved from a green stone that was not native to the region, and, in the lower layer they barely opened, what was described as a metallic rod about 4 feet long, heavy and bearing markings along its length. The breastplate is the part that should bother any honest reader of the official history. The Mississippian culture, according to the textbooks, worked copper only by cold hammering. They had no smelting, no furnaces, no alloys. A 3-foot copper breastplate, hammered thin enough to wear and inscribed with symbols, would have required either a level of metallurgy the official record does not credit them with, or trade contact with a population that did have such metallurgy. Neither possibility is part of the accepted timeline. The stone disc is harder to dismiss. Polished hardstone with concentric grooves implies a lathe, or at minimum a rotary cutting tool. Neither existed in the official toolkit of the people credited with building Cahokia, and the green beads, identified at the time as a form of jadeite, do not occur naturally anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains. They had been brought from somewhere far away by someone at some point in the past and buried with the dead. That rod was never described again after that one early article. It does not appear in any later inventory. By the time the materials were officially catalogued, it had simply ceased to exist in the paper trail. This is where the story turns. Around the second week of May, a representative from the Smithsonian Institution arrived in East St. Louis. He came with 2 assistants and several large wooden crates. He did not introduce himself to the local press. He met with the landowner privately, signed papers, and within 2 days had taken possession of nearly the entire excavation. The bones, the artifacts, the rod, the breastplate, the disc, the beads, all of it was packed into crates and loaded onto a train. The farmers were paid a sum that one local account described as more than the land was worth. They were also asked to sign a statement, the contents of which were never made public, agreeing not to discuss the contents of what they had found. The crates went east. They were logged into the Smithsonian's intake records, according to a notation reproduced in a 1908 article in a regional historical journal. After that, the trail goes cold. None of the materials from the 1879 East St. Louis dig appear in any subsequent Smithsonian exhibit, in any catalogued collection, or in any published study from the Bureau of Ethnology. They simply enter the building and never come out. Now, the official position on this kind of disappearance is that 19th century record keeping was inconsistent. Materials got lost, crates got mislabeled, storage was a mess, and to be fair, that explanation accounts for some of the gaps in the archaeological record from that era. But the East St. Louis materials are not an isolated case. Between roughly 1850 and 1910, newspaper accounts from across the American Midwest and South describe dozens of similar discoveries. Giant skeletons unearthed in mounds in Ohio, giant skeletons unearthed in caves in Tennessee, giant skeletons unearthed in West Virginia, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Nevada. In nearly every case, the bones were described in detail. In nearly every case, they were taken away by someone in an official capacity. And in nearly every case, they were never seen again. In 1856, a mound near Sheboygan, Wisconsin, was opened and reportedly contained the remains of 18 individuals, several measuring over 8 feet, accompanied by copper implements and what one witness described as a slab of black stone with engraved characters. The materials were collected and sent east. None of it has been seen since. In 1879, the same year as the East St. Louis dig, a farmer in Brewersville, Indiana, uncovered a stone burial chamber containing a single skeleton measuring 9 feet 6 inches. The bones were kept in a grain mill for several years and shown to visitors. Then, according to local accounts, the mill flooded and the bones were swept away. No fragment was ever recovered and no photograph was ever taken. In 1911, in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, miners harvesting bat guano uncovered the mummified remains of individuals described in newspaper reports as between 8 and 10 feet tall, with reddish hair. Most of the materials were destroyed during the mining operation. The fragments that survived were eventually transferred to a regional museum, where they were displayed briefly before being moved into storage. Modern requests to study those remains are routinely declined. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. Either the people of the 19th century were collectively lying about the same specific kind of discovery for 60 years, or something was being systematically removed from the ground and the public record at the same time. This is where the story stops being about Illinois and starts being about something much bigger. The mound builder mystery, as it was called in the 19th century, was a real scientific debate. Before the Smithsonian officially declared in the 1890s that all American mounds had been built by ancestors of modern Native American tribes, there were serious researchers who believed the mounds had been built by an earlier and entirely different population. Their reasoning was based on the architecture, the metallurgy, the apparent astronomical alignments, and yes, on the skeletal evidence that kept being pulled out of the ground. The Bureau of Ethnology, under the direction of John Wesley Powell, made the decision to end this debate. They commissioned a massive survey of American mounds in the 1880s, the same decade as the East St. Louis discovery. The conclusion was that the mounds were the work of ancestors of local tribes, that there was no mystery, and that the giant skeleton reports were either misidentifications or hoaxes. The thing is, the men running that survey had access to actual skeletons. They had bones in their warehouses. They had artifacts in their crates. If those bones and artifacts had supported the official conclusion, you would expect them to be displayed proudly. Photographed, studied, published. Instead, they vanished. Powell himself, in private correspondence later quoted by historians, expressed concern that the public was becoming, in his words, too excited about the antiquity of American populations. He believed that scientific authority should be preserved and that wild speculation about ancient civilizations on the continent should be discouraged. His bureau set the official narrative, and the official narrative held for over 100 years. That is the part of this story that the Tartaria research community has been trying to make sense of for the better part of a decade. The Tartaria hypothesis, for those new to it, is the idea that there was once a global civilization, technologically advanced and architecturally distinctive, that existed within the last few thousand years and was systematically erased from the historical record. The evidence cited usually includes the strange uniformity of 19th century architecture across continents, the existence of star forts on every habitable landmass, the buried floors of buildings in supposedly young American cities, and the recurring appearance of structures attributed to earlier indigenous populations that those populations had no documented technology to build. You do not have to accept the entire Tartaria framework to notice something specific about the Cahokia mounds. The official story is that they were built by hand, basket by basket, by a Mississippian culture that worked exclusively in stone and bone, with no draft animals, no wheels, and no metallurgy beyond cold-hammered copper. The largest of these mounds contains an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth. It was supposedly built in stages over a few centuries by a population that left no written record, no metal tools, and no continuous oral tradition about its construction. When the Spanish first encountered the descendants of the Mississippian culture in the 16th century, those descendants did not claim to have built the mounds. They lived among them. They sometimes used them for ceremonial purposes, but they consistently said the mounds were already there when their ancestors arrived. The mounds belonged to the people who came before. Who were the people who came before? The 1879 East St. Louis discovery, if it had been allowed to enter the public scientific record intact, might have answered that question. 1,500 bodies, including individuals 9 feet tall, buried with copper, stone discs, and metallic rods, in a structured burial bed 3 layers deep, would not have been compatible with the official Mississippian story. It would have suggested a different population, a different technology, and a different timeline. And that, in the view of the alternative history community, is exactly why it disappeared. There is more to this pattern than just the bones. The same 19th century newspapers that reported the East St. Louis dig also reported on other strange features of the American bottom. The clay and ash layers that separated the burial strata at the dig site matched almost exactly descriptions of similar layers found at mound sites in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The orientation of the skeletons, east to west, was consistent across hundreds of sites in the eastern half of the continent. The artifacts, the copper crescents, the polished stone discs, the green beads, appear again and again in mound openings from Wisconsin all the way down to Mississippi. Whatever this culture was, it was widespread. It was organized, it had trade routes, it had a uniform burial practice, it had a shared symbolic language carved into copper and stone. And it had, if the witnesses are to be believed, a population that included individuals built on a scale we no longer see. This was not a primitive people. This was the remnant of something coherent, and it had been buried both literally and bureaucratically by the time the textbooks were finalized. There is one more detail worth mentioning before we close this out. In 1962, a construction crew working on the expansion of Interstate 55 just outside Collinsville, Illinois, accidentally cut into a previously unmapped section of the Cahokia Mound complex. According to a short report filed by the contracting company, the crew uncovered human remains of unusual size and ceremonial materials of unknown classification. The site was immediately classified as a federal archaeological zone. The construction was rerouted. The materials were removed by a team from the Illinois State Museum. And, like the 1879 dig, none of those materials have ever been displayed or published. The same pattern. 83 years later, the same field, the same outcome. There was a brief mention of the 1962 find in a regional newspaper, but the story was killed before it ran in any larger paper. A reporter who tried to follow up on it 3 years later was told that the records had been sealed and that no further information would be released. He published a short piece about the wall he had hit and then dropped the story. He is no longer alive to ask about it. The pattern of suppression is what makes the East St. Louis case worth revisiting, because it is not just that the bones disappeared, it is that the witnesses, the men who actually stood in that trench and held those femurs in their hands, also stopped talking. The landowner, identified in some accounts as a man named Conrad, sold his property within 2 years of the dig and moved to Missouri. He never gave another public interview. The county surveyor, Hollis, who made the original skull sketch, retired from public work in 1881 and refused to answer any further questions about what he had seen. The Globe Democrat reporter, who wrote the most detailed account, was reassigned to cover livestock auctions and never reported on archaeology again. The smaller paper editors who picked up the story moved on to other things, and the farmers, the men who actually swung the picks and pulled the skulls out of the clay, vanished from the record entirely. This is the shape of the cover-up, if there was one. Not a dramatic threat, not a public denial, just a slow, careful erasure. Money changed hands, documents were signed, witnesses were encouraged to find other things to talk about, and within a decade the story was no longer a story. It was a piece of local folklore, a rumour, a thing the old-timers in East St. Louis used to mention at the saloon when they had been drinking, before everyone who remembered it was gone. That is how history gets edited. Not with fire, with patience. If you zoom out from the East St. Louis dig and look at the entire continent across that same 40-year window, you start to see the same shape repeating in different places. Newspaper accounts of giant skeletons from Minnesota in 1868, from New York in 1871, from Arizona in 1891, from Georgia in 1894, from Kentucky in 1903. Dozens of accounts, hundreds of witnesses, and the same outcome every time. The bones go somewhere, the records go quiet. The story enters the realm of small-town legend where it is easy to laugh at and easier to forget. The Tartaria framework applied to this pattern suggests a single explanation, that the bones being removed from the American interior were the physical remains of the previous civilization, the one that built the mounds, the star forts, the buried foundations under cities like Chicago and Detroit and Cincinnati. The civilization whose architecture was reattributed, whose technology was rationalized away, and whose population, the actual people who walked those streets and built those plazas, was systematically scrubbed from the record. Whether that explanation is correct is something each viewer has to decide for themselves. The evidence has been carefully managed. The witnesses are dead. The bones are sealed in warehouses, if they exist at all. And the official story, the one about a Mississippian culture that built the largest pre-Columbian city in North America with stone tools and willpower, is the only story you will ever read in a textbook. But there are corners of the record that the textbook never reached. Small-town historical societies still hold yellowed cuttings from papers that no longer exist. County libraries in Illinois and Missouri still file boxes of 19th century pamphlets that no academic has ever cited. Private collectors quietly hold artifacts that match the descriptions from the 1879 dig, passed down through families, never displayed, never authenticated. The full record is not gone. It is scattered. It is sitting in attics and basements and shoeboxes, in the kind of places that no institution audits, waiting for someone to put the pieces back together. And the pattern is not just American. The same kind of large skeletal evidence has been reported from sites in Patagonia, in the Caucasus, in the Solomon Islands, in northern China. The same kind of artifacts, the polished discs, the inscribed metal, the long bones laid in ritual orientation, appear in burials that were opened in the same era by the same kind of officials with the same outcome. Whatever was being uncovered in East St. Louis in 1879 was apparently being uncovered all over the world at roughly the same time, and the response in every country was almost identical. Collect it, crate it, file it, forget it. That cannot be coincidence. That has to be policy. Who set the policy is the harder question. The institutional answer would point to the gradual professionalization of archaeology in the late 19th century. The desire to enforce scientific standards, the need to discourage hoaxes and amateur speculation. That is the answer that makes the disappearances explicable without conspiracy. And there is some truth to it. The era was full of hoaxes, full of frauds, full of opportunists trying to sell phony fossils to credulous newspaper editors. But the alternative answer, the one the Tartaria community gravitates toward, is more uncomfortable. That what was being suppressed was not a hoax but a truth, that the institutions that hardened in the late 1800s, the Smithsonian, the Bureau of Ethnology, the regional museums, were not just refining science, they were defining which past was allowed to be remembered and which past would be quietly removed from the shelves. The bones from East St. Louis would have been physical evidence in that argument, and physical evidence is much harder to dismiss than a newspaper account. So the bones went into crates, and the crates went into a building, and the building has been there ever since. And somewhere inside it, possibly, the femurs and the skulls and the metallic rod are still sitting on a shelf in a sub-basement in a box labelled with a code number that no longer corresponds to any active catalogue. Or they are not. Possibly they were destroyed. Possibly they were sold off privately. Possibly they were always exactly what the official story said they were, just slightly larger than average humans, and the witnesses simply exaggerated, and the cover-up is in our imagination. You decide. There is a tendency when stories like this surface to dismiss them as folklore, to assume the newspaper accounts were sensationalized, the witnesses were unreliable, and the missing evidence is missing because it was never really there in the first place. That is an easy answer. It is also the answer that requires you to believe that hundreds of 19th century witnesses, working independently across thousands of miles, all happened to fabricate the same specific kind of lie. The same anomalies, the same disappearances, the same officials arriving to confiscate the evidence. That is a lot to swallow. The other possibility is harder. The other possibility is that the official history of North America, the one taught in schools, the one repeated in museums, the one that holds Cahokia up as a fascinating but ultimately conventional pre-Columbian settlement, is missing several large pieces. Pieces that were dug up in the spring of 1879, pieces that were loaded onto a train, pieces that are still in a warehouse somewhere, or were quietly destroyed, or are sitting in a sealed collection that no researcher will ever see. We will probably never know which possibility is correct. The witnesses are dead, the bones are gone, the land has been built over with highways, gas stations and subdivisions. The field where the Plow crew sank into a 1,500 body burial bed is now, by best estimate, a stretch of warehouses and a freight yard. But the mounds are still there. Monk's Mound still rises 100 feet above the plain. The smaller mounds still scatter across the American bottom like the surviving teeth of something much larger. And every few years a road crew or a utility worker or a curious archaeologist still pulls something out of the ground that does not quite fit the official story. And every time the same thing happens. The materials get logged, the materials get classified, the materials disappear. If you want to see the mounds for yourself, they are still open to the public. You can walk up Monk's Mound on a wooden staircase. You can stand on top of the largest earthen structure in pre-Columbian North America and look out at the skyline of St. Louis, 10 miles to the west. You can try to imagine the city that once stood there. You can try to imagine the people who built it. And you can ask yourself quietly, while you are standing up there, whether the size of those people might have been larger than anyone is currently allowed to say. The Plow crew of 1879 knew. The newspaper reporters knew. The county surveyor knew. The men from the Smithsonian who packed the crates knew. The rest of us are still waiting to be told. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. We are working through a long list of buried discoveries from across the American interior, and the next one might be from a field closer to your own backyard than you think.